series, Belarusian plays and Russian novel. All the panelists are ready. I remind you that you have 20 minutes each, and we start. The first speaker is Elin Parkman-Smirnova from Uppsala University, and her speech is entitled Nation and Memory in Russian Cartoons of the 21st Century. Elin, please.
Okay, good day, everyone. My name is Elin Parkman-Smirnova, and I have a master's degree on Russian language from Uppsala University. And I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference to be able to participate. And it has been very interesting to listen to all the lectures that has been held so far. So now I will try to show you my presentation in a minute. Can you see it? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's okay.
Thank you. The work that I'm going to present is a study on how notions of Russianness is represented in children's cartoons from the 21st century. This by use of folklore, by basing on national myths, or by invoking events from the past. It's a subject that connects to the fields of memory studies and to a constructivist view in which matters of national identity can both shape and be shaped by political action. Currently, it is not in the first hand a study on recycling of socialist culture. Still, it deals with topics of Soviet nostalgia, as it focuses on the recycling of a way older material that has done a stopover in the Soviet period as well. What I will try to suggest is a way in which periods of differing rules is linked together. So here is just for the first inspiration, some illustration from a cartoon series for small girls. They're very loosely based on Russian fairy tales. Very loosely, I would say. The antagonist from the folk tales, the immortal, is the school principal, for example, and Baba Yaga, the witch, figures as a trickster or a helper. And there are magic touch screen mirrors in every corner, but not more than that. So this was the subject for my master's thesis, for which I analyzed 17 animated films for children created in Russia between the years 2000 and 2020. These movies were chosen as they are based on folk tales, historical events, or is characterized by an otherwise rich use of folk. In the following lecture, I will present only a few of them. The Russian cartoons of today are produced by different companies in Russia in a tradition that was largely formed by Socialist, the highly qualitative and productive animation studio of the Soviet Union, which between 1936 and 1999 created around 1,500 cartoons. Searching for ideological features in cartoons is highly relevant, even though it is a medium that is still often analyzed from a merely technical or didactic point of view. Scholar Henry Giroux has devoted several works to puncture the myth of the harmlessness of children's culture, arguing, for example, that Walt Disney Company effectively has used the brand of innocent entertainment to spread American middle-class ideals through the world. So here I will give you a picture from the film The Lion King. I think you recognize it. It's Scar, an usually swart lion accompanied by Hispanic hyenas. Things lead under the Islamic rule.
Elin, I'm sorry. Could you please maybe speak louder and maybe turn off your camera because your connection is not stable? If it's okay.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yes, I think it is my internet connection. If it doesn't work, then maybe we can switch places and I can move to another place. But can I try to continue?
Yes, please.
As for Soyuz Multfilm, scholar Natalie Kanonenko described how the cartoons by Soyuz film was an important tool for forging an image of the normal childhood and spreading the Russian language in the Union republics. It is important to mention that the cartoons of today is created not by a single state enterprise, but by many commercial companies. Still, all the films studied in my material has received financing from the Russian State Cinema Fund. To put all this in a context, I will begin with a short background. I will start by talking about the role of memory in shaping national identity in today's Russia and the evolution of public memory in the post-Soviet period. It is well studied how the struggle for finding a national identity has become increasingly actualized and an explicit matter of priority for the Russian political leadership, due to the emptiness of state-founding ideology that Russia found itself in after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Besides orthodoxy and sometimes hedonic spirituality, resources from the past is often invoked to form a Russian identity and to mobilize group solidarity within the nation. What is interesting to note is which particular times or events that is used in this process. Olga Malinova writes in the article Constructioning the Usable Past, how different historical periods is more usable than others, depending on what the country considers itself to be today. To rely on the past for building a national identity would often mean to identify a certain time of glory, but it might as well be a time when the country faced suffering or injustice. In the post-Soviet Russian context, this can be shown by the example of how remembrance of the revolution of 1917 is met by ambivalence by the country's political leadership. The revolution would constitute a problematic task since it's the founding myth of the predecessing order and also includes the delicate element of disruption and people rising against power. Much more successful is the remembrance of the Great Patriotic War, a memory which allows the focus on people unifying in the protection against a cruel intruder. The 20 years that have passed since the fall of the Soviet Union has seen a shift in the way in which Russia looks at its past. In the words of Olga Malinova, this is a shift from self-criticism to self-glorification. If in the 90s the official gaze was outward and forward to a new future, today it has increasingly turned into itself in search for guidance. With the narrative of Russia as a newborn country that was prevalent at that time, the 90s, the Soviet era was seen as a rupture in history, a deviation from the country's historical path. As time has shown, a system that lasted for 7 decades is not that easily excluded. A narrative that has come to be dominating today is one about historical continuity of the 1,000-year-old Russian state. In this narrative, the revolution of 1917, as well as the so-called wild 90s, fits in as cyclically recurring periods of disorder, in contrast to the now prevailing stability that is emphasized by the political leadership. In the recycling of myths from the past, it is important to acknowledge the way the recycled material relates to one another. In the book Memory Politics in Contemporary Russia, Marielle Wiermars suggests to add the concept remediation to research on culture and memory. This concept is based on the assumption that no media can exist in isolation. Repeated mediation of myths creates an intertextual network that new media can answer to, relate to, and challenge. So manifestation of cultural memory do not exist independently of each other, but rather behave as if they form a constellation, a sort of memory cluster. These clusters are shaped by synchronic connections and composed of associated memories or narratives. They can be connected by historical factors, like persons or events from a given time period, or topical factors, like the end of empire, revolutionary tensions, times of troubles. The prevalence of such clusters increases the dynamics of remediation. It allows reinterpretation or challenging and establish memory through even small shifts in focus from one person or event to another within the same cluster. Another phenomenon is when a specific memory is given several layers by being remediated over periods of time. She calls this memory chains. This act of repetition can help to establish connections among these periods and create links that bind different times together. To explain this, Maria Wirmas uses the metaphor. Sorry, I got it wrong. Uses the metaphor of a rolling snowball that gains new layers with the original core intact. This layering often takes the shape of cyclical historical parallels or analogies that stretches into the present. As the perhaps most immediate example of remediation of this material, you can see this picture here. I would like to draw your attention to the franchise of the three Bogatirs, the Epic Knights, Alyosha Popovich, Ilya Muromets, and Vladimir Nikitic, and their adventures in Prince Vladimir's service in medieval Kiev. This series consists of 9 animated films created by Melnitsa Animation Studio between the years of 2004 and 2018. The first film was released in 2004. It was the first full-length animation to be recorded in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union, thus marking a resurrection of the domestic animation industry. With origins in medieval epic poems, the Belina, Bogatyr is a figure that has been in the spotlight during different periods of Russian cultural history. For example, I beg your pardon for the bad quality of the pictures. This is a painting of Mikhail Vrubil from 1899. Most of the Bogatyr epics was written down in the 18th century, became subject for wider interest and professional research in the second half of the 19th century. For this study, I find it necessary also to relate to the romantic nationalism of this time as previous period during which the past was used in order to define the nation. At the turn of the century, the Bogatyr was depicted in art by artists such as Ivan Bilibin, Mikhail Vrubil, Andrei Ryabushkin, and Viktor Vasnetsov. These works marked a break from the simple graphics of the popular prints, the blue key, and the Bogatyr received a visual appearance that has been preserved from that moment on. In a Soviet context, the Bogatyr gained popularity as a character during the 30s reconstruction of the nationalistic idea. Later on, the target group increasingly shifted to children. The epics was used in cartoons like Tibor's Childhood from 1937, Vladimir Nikitic from 1965, Teresa Mikulichna from 1975, and Ilya Muromets from which cartoons retained parts from the original epic poems, likewise as the heroic status of the Bogatyr. When the epic hero is on the horseback again in the 2000s, what we can see is far from a simple adaptation of an old tale, rather what researcher Yana Gordienko calls a retranslation of the outer shell of the tale. Gordienko points at the foregoing desacralization of the myth. Whereas the Bogatyr in the Bilinas defeated the enemy through the power of prayer and reliance on God, in the modern cartoon, it is done with pure strange weaponry and physical struggle. The same can be seen in how the antagonist Tugarin from the first film is transformed from an evil dragon spirit in the Bilina to a human of Eastern appearance. So it's a shift from an original Christian context to a context of secular kind, with the Mongol as the historical enemy. Here you can see a paraphrase of Vasnetsov's very well-known painting. So this scene is a clear example of what defines the remediation of the Bogatyr myth in the 21st century, a playful use of well-known symbols and intertextuality, like numerous quotients from Soviet comedies. So what we see is a recycling of an old myth, but at the same time is the construction. The second example I would like to show is an example on how themes in movies for children coincide with those for adults. The example is the many common features between the cartoon Fortress from 2015, as you can see to the left, that deals with the Polish attack on Smolensk in 1609, and the film Brest Fortress from 2010, that marks the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War. As you can see, similarities is visible already in the titles. Further on, both films deal with attack on a fortress by a hostile intruder from the west. The main character in both films is a young orphan named Sasha, who is the first one to become aware of the attack since he's out at night without permission. The boy begs to take up arms in protection of the fortress, but is given a false mission by an adult man in order to keep him safe. Taking into account the theories of memory clusters and of memory chains, in which events from a specific period in history can be used to symbolize another, I would like to suggest an interpretation of the cartoon Fortress, to the left, as a kind of fortifier in the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, an historical event that might in itself be too fearsome to depict in a movie for children. And so to my conclusions. The first conclusion is that among the 17 cartoons that I have analyzed, most of them are based on events in the medieval time. When I say most of them, I mean 14. Because some of them take place in a fictive but clearly Russian time and space. Leaning on previous research on Russian memory politics, I suggest that there are two reasons from a perspective of memory politics to turn to the Middle Ages. Firstly, it shows the long-lasting existence of the Russian state. Secondly, the Middle Ages comprise an uncomplicated past from a perspective of memory politics, whereas a more recent history could be dividing. And from the perspective of pure entertainment, of course, it is a time that is distant enough to serve as an abstract fairy tale time. The element of parody and deconstruction make it somehow harder to fit the film of the Bogatyvs in the theories of memory chains. If we recall the metaphor of the rolling snowball, the base layer would still impact core. The question is, would we need a metaphor for this remediation that indicates not enrichment but dilution? I would say that it might be in place to question the innocence of humor as well as the innocence of culture directed to children. The playful and ironic use of cultural values that is characteristic to the films can also be a way of consolidating them as symbols. It is possible to imagine seemingly empty significance with their effect preserved, acquired by centuries of loaded meaning. The last thing that I would like to point at is the continuity not only in content, but in aesthetics as well, that can be seen in comparing Russian cartoons of today with their predecessor in Soviet animation, and with material from the romantic nationalism of the late 19th century. This continuity suggests a spectrum of explanations. The simplest one would be the impact of nostalgia, like a universal human desire to return to the familiar. And the object for nostalgia would then obviously not be the Bogatyvs of the epics, those three that gaze into the distance in numerous reproductions of Kuznetsov's painting. But given the narrative of the 1,000-year-old Russia that has become the dominating in Russian memory politics of today, it is possible to view this recycling as a communication with previous periods. Times which hardly can be united by common reality is united by the fact that the past, or more widely to say, the fantasy of the past, during these periods has shared the same aesthetics. The cartoons of today builds a slightly modernized version of the 19th century's fantasy of the Middle Ages, a fantasy that was recycled during Soviet time. I found this a way in which the idea of the Russian state's continuity finds its visual expression. And to just an illustration from one of the new films. So that was all that I had to tell. Thank you. I hope that you did hear me.
Okay, thank you very much. That is the end. And the second speaker will be Tony Juricic. He represents Durham University. And his speech is entitled Decadent Socialism as the Belle Epoque, Recreating the Cultural Memory of Yugoslavia within the fictional microcosmos of black and white world. Tony, please.
Hello everyone. It's wonderful to be part of your conference, and I really like that you will enjoy my presentation, as well as we all enjoyed the previous presentation. That was really lovely. So just a second, let me share my screen to find my PowerPoint. Here it is. You can see it, right?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Tony Juricic, and I will be presenting the decadent socialism as a belle epoque, which tends to see how the filmmakers behind the popular TV show Black and White World recreated the cultural memory of Yugoslavia. So, for introduction, Black and White World TV show was created, directed, and written by Goran Kulenovic, and it had its premiere on Croatian national television on 2nd March 2015. The pilot episode received positive reviews by critics and audience alike. It was praised for successfully encapsulating the spirit of the 1980s through the adventures of fictional Kipčić family. The Black and White World, it starts on New Year's Eve of 1979 and follows the Kipčić as they navigate through the Yugoslav sphere and its cultural and social-political events that shaped the final years of the Socialist Federation. This paper will examine how the filmmakers deployed the fictional family to portray the period of socio-economic crisis as la Belle Epoque, or the beautiful age, a term that became common for describing a period of economic prosperity and cultural development. While La Belle Epoque implies prosperity, optimism, and development, Masha Kolanovic states that decadent socialism refers to the period of Yugoslav socialism in the late 1970s and 1980s, the period that is marked by the death of Yugoslav President Tito, Josip Broz Tito, which we all see on the image from which is taken from the TV show. Also, that period was marked by the economic crisis and the growth of nationalism, which threatened the utopian idea of Yugoslav brotherhood and unity. To examine the reconstruction of decadent socialism as la Belle Epoque in the black and white world, this paper will deploy the notion of cultural memory and its relation to Yugo nostalgia, a nostalgia for life in the late Socialist Federation. So, what is the last Yugoslav generation and what is Yugo nostalgia? Well, the cultural memory of, as scholar Ljubica Spaskovska writes, the last Yugoslav generation serves as the foundation on which the filmmaker Goran Kulenovic developed his characters and narratives. Spaskovska says that the members of the last Yugoslav generation are individuals born between 1954 and 1969, individuals that belong in the category of youth, age from 16 to 98, at some point during the 1980s. It is the generation that came of age during the political and economical crisis that marked the late socialism, or the decadent socialism. Despite the different crises that took the federation through the 80s, the influx of Western influences into the Yugoslav popular culture helped to shape decadent socialism into la Belle Epoque. The influence of Western pop culture products is particularly noted in music, as the 80s saw the rise of punk, rock, and Novi Val, new wave movement. The Novi Val bands, Bijelo Dugme, Prljavo Kazalište, and Azra still possess a prominent role within the shared post-Yugoslav generational consciousness. The role of music is significant had a significant importance for the study of fictional microcosmos of black and white world, as the show itself borrows its title from Predivog Kazalište songs, Crno-bijeli svijet. Furthermore, the characters of the show often encounter musicians and other cultural workers. Funny enough, interesting to be more precise, while the title of the show is based on the song by Predivog Kazalište, every single episode is based on a popular song from the 80s. So this just amplifies how important the music was for the last generation, for the last Yugoslav generation. Also, the interrelation between music and characters is most notable is Voljan Kipčić, a journalist for the student paper, and his friend Žungl, photographer for the paper. Through the series, the two friends, which you can see in the background, encounter and interact with some of the most influential actors of the Yugoslav music scenes. So Žungl is the guy with a cigarette. He's a photographer, while his friend is Kipo, the main protagonist of the TV show. So, the dominant role of music within the TV show, one can note that the use of this shared generational aspect is linked to the notion of Yugo nostalgia. Scholar Mitja Velikonja defines Yugo nostalgia as nostalgia for images of Yugoslavia, its political symbols, artifacts of mass culture, popular beliefs, and fond memories of those times. All while they also value the value of brotherhood and unity. On the other hand, for Dubravka Ugrešić, Yugo nostalgia had a subversive element at the beginning of the 90s, when the term Yugo nostalgics was used as a derogatory label for people who were against their so-called newfound independence. Ugrešić points out that the Yugo nostalgics were castigated as people who grieved for the death of Yugoslavia. However, as Ugrešić states, Yugo nostalgia in recent years became a commodity that lost its subversive quality of the personal resistance to the raging nationalism that erupted at the beginning of the 1990s. This can be also corroborated by the cultural products, especially music and film, that deploy Yugo nostalgia to evoke fond memories. The influence of Novi Val still lingers in some of the contemporary bands. The musicians still sing about good old times, and they utilize the musical style found in bands such as Indeksi, Novi Fosili, Denis and Denis. At the same time, filmmakers utilize Yugo nostalgic imagery along with the 80s music as the soundtracks for their films or TV shows to amplify the nostalgic element. The synthesis of film and music is most evident in a black and white world, where TV series format allow the filmmakers to fully develop the Yugo nostalgic microcosmos. And how to build a Yugo nostalgic microcosmos within a TV show? Well, in TV industry, there is a thing called the pilot episode. The aim of pilot episode is to build the fictional world for the series, and the episode introduces us to the main characters and side characters. Also, it sets up the narratives and overall setting that will develop throughout the series. Based on the viewership and critical reception, the pilot episode serves as the foundation stone on which the show's future depends. With that in mind, how did the filmmakers behind the black and white world build their world within the first 45 minutes? Of which will later become a 4-season run. It was pointed out earlier that the filmmakers utilized the elements of Yugo nostalgia and the collective consciousness of the last Yugoslav generation. While Yugo nostalgic elements serve as the building blocks, it is crucial to induce them into a cohesive whole in order to create a narrative that can appeal not only to the last Yugoslav generation, but also to the generation that came after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. In the post-Yugoslav generation, that despite not being alive during the 80s, or if they're alive, they were just babies, or they were just kids. But that post-Yugoslav generation possessed the level of curiosity for the cultural products that emerged during the socialist period, especially towards the new wave music of the 1980s. To make Yugo nostalgia work within the TV show, it was crucial to create characters and narratives that can serve as the backbone for Yugoslav cultural products. Therefore, the pilot episode is crucial in creating the fictional microcosmos which will appeal to wider audience. Therefore, the pilot episode opens with the protagonist, Voljan Kipčić, coming home from mandatory military service, just in time for New Year's Eve. Military service is the first instance of the Yugo nostalgic element in the series, because the service was mandatory for every man from the 6 countries, so Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and Bosnia. and it often became a place where long-lasting friendships were made. The second instance of Yugo nostalgia is Volkswagen Beetle, the car popularly known as Buba, sub-creation for Beetle. Due to its affordable price, Buba quickly became a common sighting on the roads across Yugoslavia. So, with mandatory military service and Buba being introduced in the opening minutes of the pilot episode, the filmmakers prepared the stage to take their audience on the ride through the Zagreb of 1980s. Furthermore, the cultural products are first introduced with character of Zhaz, Voljan's younger brother, who is introduced to the audience as he prepares for a New Year's party. He's seen listening to a popular punk band, Parafi, whose song about Yugoslav police or militia was censored at the time due to his controversial lyrics about police brutality. When he makes his way to his father's house, the father and his guests, they berate the young man for listening to this decadent music that came from the West. The music that sings about the futility of life. And especially there is one pretty cool scene when they say that the younger generation will always take the very worst that came with the West. Also, the scene marks the first division within the black and white world, where the younger generation are keener towards the Western cultural imports, which made the last stage of socialism into La Belle Époque. At the same time, the main character's parents argue about the country's socio-economic situation, which transformed Yugoslavia's politics into decadent socialism. The critical stance towards the Yugoslav politics is best exemplified in Kipčić Sr., father of Voljan and Zhaz, who openly through the series admits that this state of things cannot last for long. His claim that everything will go to hell in 10 years or so is supported by other parental figures, including Unas, who is Zhaz's stepsister and aspiring actor's father, and Voljan's grandfather, who decides to move from oppressive Yugoslavia to a more liberal states. Here, one can notice that the black and white world can be divided into two groups: the last Yugoslav generation and the first Yugoslav generation, or the generation that was born during or after the end of World War II. In the series, the younger generation embodied La Belle Époque of the 80s as a time of rock shows, parties, and liberalism, while the parents are representatives of decadent socialism with their comments and warnings of what may or what will come. Despite the parental figures and the warnings about what future holds due to the rising nationalism and crumbling economy, decadent socialism is not a dominant element in the film. The viewer can notice that the parental figures are mostly side characters, while the dominant narratives are linked to the characters that belong to the last Yugoslav generation. Sorry. So, if you compare the black and white world to another pop cultural product, the series can be described as Forrest Gump set in Yugoslavia. In a similar manner of Forrest Gump from Robert Zemeckis' film, Forrest Gump, he witnessed every major American cultural and political event. Similar to Forrest Gump, the characters of black and white world, they were present during the very crucial moments that shaped La Belle Époque. They were present at the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo. They encountered a wide array of famous singers and actors, including the singer Blondie at the end of the first episode. Also, some of the characters work at the popular radio station known for its prank joke and the first openly gay host in Yugoslavia. Furthermore, the characters are seen going to Trieste in Italy to buy clothes that they could not find in Yugoslavia. Also, they tape bootleg VH tapes of Hollywood blockbusters. One of the best examples is when the protagonist of the show, after having one beer too many, encounters a famous singer-songwriter, Darko Rundek from the band Haustor. He encounters Rundek and he starts to babbling about he knows the perfect way how to start a new song, about how he loves the girls in their summer dresses. And that later became a part of Haustor's hit single, My First Love, Moja prva ljubav. And the first line of the lyrics goes, I love girls in their summer dresses. So now, here we have this penetration of fiction into the reality. Also, another example of meeting famous musicians is seen at the end of the pilot episode when Kipo meets the famous Blondie. Throughout the series, characters willingly or rather unwillingly become part of urban legends. This includes the accident with a motorbike that ended up amongst the lions in Zagreb Zoo. Also, somehow it ended this also on the Russian TV station. Although I think this is just part of the fiction. Also, it is crucial to discuss the end of La Belle Époque, where the only trace of the 1990s is seen in the first half of the third season opening episode, but the characters found themselves in the chaos that ensued with the war that followed the dissolution of Yugoslavia. During these scenes, the audience can note a tonal shift in the themes and characters and the color correction, where the saturated colors gave a grittier look to the opening minutes of the third season. The sudden shift from La Belle Époque to the war-torn country is reflected in treatment of Una, a half Serbian character who lost her job at the National Theatre due to her mixed nationality and her marriage to a Serb. The fictional character's fate is similar to that of Mira Furlan, a late actress who was forced out of Croatia due to public smear campaign and numerous death threats for her marriage to a Serbian filmmaker, Goran Gajic. However, the narrative regarding the 1990s was abandoned near the end of the episode, with several twists not being resolved in the later episodes. Instead of returning to the 90s, the producers opened the fourth season with a short scene where now elderly characters that represent the last Yugoslav generation make their way towards the train station in order to meet someone. Similar to the scenes from the opening of the third season, the opening sequence of the fourth season is also left open-ended. The filmmakers decided to end the show in days following the Chernobyl accident, with an episode where Kipo, as the series' main protagonist, became father to a baby girl. Instead of concluding the face of his characters through the narratives, filmmakers deployed a slideshow with photos of virtually aged characters, where the only indication of their fate is that some of the characters' photos were in black and white, indicating that they are dead. So, for conclusion, the opening of the third season serves as the only mention of the war and dissolution that followed the end of La Belle Époque. How could the 90s offer a proper endgame for the show that dealt with the good times? This is the reason why the filmmakers behind the show ended its final season in 1987, because it was the end of La Belle Époque. Because in 1987, it marked the rise of Slobodan Milosevic, who came to power that year. Also, he is one of the culprits for Yugoslav wars. Also, one can argue that the filmmaker's decision to end the narrative with the events of 1987 possessed a symbolic nature to indicate that La Belle Époque ended with rising nationalism across the Yugoslav sphere, which can be also seen in the scene where on the radio, one of the listeners made an anti-Serb statement. Instead of rushing into 1990s, the decade that was characterized by bloodshed, black and white world ended its run with the decision to keep the fictionalized version of Yugoslavia as the microcosmos, devoid of the violence that followed the decade of decadent socialism. Thank you.
Tony, thank you very much. We have a question for you at chat, but I think the time for questions and answers will come after all the papers. And now is third speaker is Maria Polakova from the Laboratory for Drama and the Other Studies in Central and Eastern Europe, Warsaw University. And her speech is entitled Neon Reality by Paweł Priaszko. Maria, please.
Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Maria Polakova, and at the moment I'm living in the UK, but I'm still cooperating with our laboratory in Warsaw University. So I think, first of all, I had to thank for organizing such an event. I think that those topics are very interesting and really highly needed in the present times. Speaking about my research, unfortunately, due to the time limits, I had to shrink it a little bit to one play only. However, hopefully we will have more occasions to meet and to introduce our interests. So let me start. For the last year, the most civilized world is observing situation in Belarus, the way how the last president election was happening not only raised lots of concerns, but also shown huge conflicts inside the society. This conflict is visible not only in specific ways of expressing ideas, methods, but also a position of symbols and even traditional and cultural heritage, which different parts of society are using in creating their national ideas. From one hand, we saw original and based on modern technologies and trends activities of generation willing to bring some changes to economy, culture, education, and so on. But from the other, it was very well known and recognizable motifs, cliché, slogans, those from times of USSR. The fact of even existence of such a confrontation seems to be something really amazing, considering the conditions and terms in Belarus, which without any doubts made huge impact on developing specific mentality and way of thinking of people living there. It will need a lot of research in the future and observation, I think, before we will be able to identify how huge impact political, social, educational atmosphere in Belarus had on younger generation. You can imagine that for the last 27 years, we had already two different generations. For example, generations Z, or millennials, as they called, or generation Alpha, that the newest, or digitals, like they were called as well. So both of those were growing in the times of ruling only one president. So political conjuncture created such a particular type of regime, seemingly ideal social country, with low number of employment, low criminal level, corruption, low prices, well-working social services, and with very, very clean streets, which Minsk usually is famous from. But if you would look more carefully, you will see that this reality is not more than just a picture. There is no place for any alternative ways of thinking, for experiments, like there is no space for younger generation with their need of modernization and everything what the big world around can offer. In reality, government is controlling most part of economical, political, and cultural life. Considering that, no wonders that the most mass media are also controlled by the government and have to show or introduce the reality according to official line. All of that pushing out non-state newspapers, magazines, publishers, channels to outsiders' areas. That was especially strongly displayed in the last months when we witnessed how many journalists from independent press, TV, internet channels were arrested, given fines, taking away their licenses, and only just for doing their job. Same is happening with theaters. Non-formal or non-state culture can exist only in very marginal forms. In Belarus are still special commissions which can censor, control, introduce ideas, forms of expressions, and so on. This is probably one of the main reasons why most young playwrights looking for realization their projects or plays abroad, first of all in Russia. But some of them also bring it to Poland and other countries. This is probably one of the main characteristics of so-called phenomenon of Belarusian drama, when authors are becoming mostly recognized and popular in the other countries and seems to be sort of invisible for the theaters and cultural institutions in their motherland. So Pavel Pryashko is one of the representative such a phenomenon. His career is mostly happening and developing in Russia. A few of his plays also was cited in Poland, and plus some of his plays were translated and published as a part of a series of anthologies in Warsaw University and Professor Moskvin. A couple words about him itself, about Pavel Preško. He was born in Minsk in 1975. He started his writing career in the beginning, just right in the beginning of 21st century. And one of the first plays awarded was his play Serpentine in 2004. Since then, he became more and more recognizable in festivals, including very well-known Golden Mask in Russia, in many competitions, and more his plays are appearing on the stage. Just a year ago in Moscow were released 2 volumes of his plays, which is another proof of interest to this author as well. Speaking about the influence on him as a writer, it's not possible to not point out his strong connections with new drama and documentary drama. In lots of plays, we can see different techniques taken from that, like verbatim, specific way of collecting, introducing materials in plays based on almost documentary descriptions. But the most unique for his plays is creating that sort of specific atmosphere, his experiments with basic for play forms and meanings. Preško, as a talented observer, not only passing on such a vacuum atmosphere, but also showing that sort of emotional metamorphosis, mind flow transformation happening to his protagonists, in whom, without any doubts, we can see lots of characteristics of Belarusian society. So very often we can even see the name for that, for Belarus as last Soviet Republic on a post-USSR area. Here is important to mention that describing reality in his own way, Preško is not really giving his opinions or constructing his protagonist as positive or negative. He is rather could be compared to anthropologist, someone who is just observing and tracing processes and their consequences. One of the probably most emotional plays by him is Bellywood, created in 2006, presented on stage by Vladimir Shcherban as a part of the project We Self-Identification, leading by Free Theatre, led by Nikolai Khalezin and Natalia Kalada. This play is using methods of stream of consciousness. So it's not very easy to describe the story itself. However, in the very short words, it is showing some time of the life of 28 years old Andrei from Minsk. We see him at the beginning in a trolleybus, observing 2 kids who are addicted from drugs, 2 brothers, 10 and 15. They ripped out phrases and mixed with the effort to not vomit. And they bond with poetic description and adjectives created by Andrei's imagination. Here I have some quotes which I had to translate by myself, so apologies for any strange words probably. So, in the man-like embrace of August, under the terry wafer of the sky, it happened. On the evening full of fragrance, I rode in the trolleybus number 36 to the sunset, as a cowboy went to red sun. Double trolleybus. He stood and looked out in the window, checking the gun from time to time. I listened to Tiger Lily's disc matrix recorded. What album, I don't remember. The sound is as usually, 2-3 stripes. The Book of Fate, E.G., 3 solid lines on the tortoise shell. Yellow foam runs down from the lips into the sweater. He throws his head back, Adam's apple like a bird, sharp, raging in the throat. Then he bends down and already pours everything out with a fountain. The smell cannot be confused with anything else. Cold, sour bread with a mixture of acetone. End of quote. Andrei is leaving the trolleybus, giving the music player to brothers so they can, like he's saying, still have some hope in life. And then is his journey through the street. People he meeting, his friends, girls, passers-by, homeless, policemen, or milicians, we should say, and so on. All of it is mixed in with description of surroundings like streets, roads, sky, and at the top of all, Andrei is trying to find and shoot his enemy, probably his sister husband, who is cheating and beating her from time to time. At the end of the play, he transforming into bird-like Iona, bringing that way history to the Bible prophet. This triggering reflection about meaning of God, meaning of life, but apparently Iona is not really interested in all of that anymore. All he wants is some bread, water, and roof over his head. At the end, we see a group of birds under control of carrying master with whip and handful of grain. And here the quote, everyone is kneeling. And I saw him right away, well dressed with a whip in his hand. I got scared, I screamed, I crawled on my knees with the others. Everyone crawls on their knees in a circle. I was hidden behind others, and he found me and always walked next to me. So caring and so serious, he tapped his hands with a whip, and I did not dare to look at him. After the walk, he poured some dry grains for us. He fed us. We ate with gratitude, and then I finally realized that I was no longer a human being. End of quote. All this is put it on the television reports with a style of those from times of USSR. Here I want to mark that Pavel Preshko sometimes was just noticing documentary reportages from TV, like original, and put it in his play that way. So those reports or reportages with its ideological and propaganda character, the introduction of these elements into the play emphasizes the absolute isolation of Andrei's reality and other characters from the reality presented by reporters. Speaking of that, it should be noted that they are woven into the play rather as a kind of commentary only. Instead of supplementing, clarifying, or explaining what is happening, television is creating its own fiction, having nothing to do with objective reality. And thanks to this, television more and more skillfully avoids showing the actual problems of the population, poverty, so it is not surprising that the main character, as well as others, completely does not pay any attention to the information coming from the turned-on TV. The gap between real life and official truth is showing in several levels, and first of all on the level of language. Already at the first reportage, which is bursts into the world of the protagonist, while drunk Andrei is going in a taxi to his imaginary dessert, we have, and here the quote, "The elegantly dressed, our best workers now become the example of greatly developed consumer service industry in the Minsk and its region. The idea to switch workwear to business suit marked the beginning of the first changes here, reviving the village, increasing the growth rates of agricultural production. Our country does not forget about improving the working conditions of the participants of this government program. Villager everyday life becomes easier and happier." End of quote. Compared to the vocabulary inherent in the characters of the play, this statement is rich in linguistic cliché, so characteristical to propaganda and ideological populism. And this is probably the moment when Andrei's language, which is shocking before with its vulgarity and crucial naturalism, becomes so much more natural and full of normal human emotions. Television reality seems so unreal that Andrei simply does not pay attention, so it's just passing next to him without causing absolutely any reaction, any interactions. And how could it be otherwise when from the reports, which is showing happy citizens working for the good of society and the state, young people doing sports, and in the meantime, going out, you will see teenagers addicted from the drugs who have, and here I have some quotes from the play, who have no more than 3 years left, drank pieces of the picture of hamburgers on the window and beaten by cops after, homeless who were afraid of guard and drank soap from the beer glass on the shop's porch, sparrows and beggars collecting crumbs from the road. Andre, if I should apply, is constantly nauseous, which is a natural reaction from one side of the body to alcohol poisoning. But it seems that this is also reflects his rejection of the schizophrenic dual reality of the world around him and the false picture presented by the media. In Andre's world, friends are committing suicides one after another, jumping from the balcony. And his love comes to disgusting sexual intercourse. For all of it, obviously there is no place in television reality where everything has to be right, political correct. A few words must be said about the title of the play itself, which is marking again isolation of two concepts, two worlds, Belarus from one side and Hollywood, or rather even Bollywood from the other. And well, this seems to be a perfect name for a country which reality is presented by television like a cheap stuff, a kind of schematic, low quality movie, where propaganda programs are keeping showing society on the path to a brighter future and happier days. It seems that there are only two ways out of this situation, either to jump from the balcony or to hate everything around, not excluding yourself as the main character does. And here the quote, "I'm a degenerate of the Belarusian land. I hate everything about it, folklore, language, veterans, historical places. I hate the government and the opposition. I hate the people living next to me, especially business people, all kinds of merchandisers, energetic, sociable, promising, and so on. And to you, intellectuals, I have something special. You are identified elite creators. You can joke, mock, make fun of me. You can, with your sarcastic grin, look down on me like you are the smartest and you know everything about this life. Leave me my primitiveness and my second-class face. There are only 3 wishes, 3 nuts for Cinderella. I want to drink vodka, fuck, and kill." End of quote. In such a situation, another ending seems impossible, just as it seemed impossible to save a person, Andre, writhing and screaming in pain somewhere in the attic. Nor do final words of the bird-like Yona stroking Andre's head with imaginary wind bring hope. Here's the quote, "Trust me, I'll fix it. They will find you now. I think about it so deeply and so much. You just have a little patience. You just wait a little bit." End of quote. At the end of the play, we have ellipsis, which seems to be expressing incompleteness, like a postponement of the question, how long will Belarus remain a Bollywood? And how long introducing the state media reality will look like neon lights, bright in colors, creating unrealistic images, but leaving all the rest in darkness, ignoring facts and objective truth. Thank you for listening.
Maria, thank you for your speech. And the last speaker is Thomas Fritzmayer from Higher School of Economics in Moscow. We talk about continuous discontinuities, recycling the village prose genre in Roman Senczin's Zona Zatopienia. Thomas, please.
Yes, hello. Do you see my presentation already?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. In my contribution to the conference, I address a case of other straightforward cultural recycling, which is Roman Zinn's 2015 novel Zona Zatoplenia, or The Flood Zone, which makes no secrets of its indebtedness to Valentin Rasputin's Prashanius Matroi, or Farewell to Matyara, from 1976. Just as its Soviet-era precursor, it narrates an intrusive act of post-Soviet infrastructural modernization, the construction of a hydroelectric power plant in Western Siberia. Both times, the flooding of rural Siberian villages, the relocation of their inhabitants, and the annihilation of pre-existing social structures stand in for a far from equal struggle between centers of power and peripheral regions. The direct linkage between the two texts is established already in the title Zona Zatoplenia, which is a term used first in chapter 2 of Rasputin's novel to denote areas destined for flooding. I aim to show that Zona Zatoplenia by recycling one of the most well-known works of the genre village prose, that is a genre of Russian literature from roughly the 50s to the 70s, which focuses on the vanishing world of the Russian village, operates in a double-bound formation of nostalgia discourses. It picks up on its precursor's lament of the disappearance of traditional rural communities, while simultaneously longing for the gesture of intellectual advocacy for the peripheral subaltern. I will analyze this form of recycling in 3 general steps. First, I'll briefly outline Zona Zatoplenia's strategy as based on the continuity of Soviet and post-Soviet colonization. Then I will analyze one key passage as an instance of formal recycling, and finally, very briefly, suggest a conceptual proximity between formal recycling and the quest for new genres in moments of historical impasse. In doing so, I rely a lot on Sergei Ushakin's concept of retrofitting. Ushakin launches against interpretations of nostalgia as outright politicized behavior. In his words, by emphasizing the ideological origin of a particular cultural device or a stylistic configuration, the anti-nostalgia critics tend to overlook the function of enframing that these remakes and reproductions accomplish. Ushakin thus proposes to focus less on ideological content than on the affordances of textual material and formal frameworks, which are mobilized in the reuse of preceding cultural objects. Focusing on the forms themselves, he argues that, quote, the main task of impeccably imitated old structures is to produce an already known and previously encountered effect of recognition, to point toward a common vocabulary of symbolic gestures. Herein lies the essence of what he terms retrofitting. In the absence of signs able to express new post-Soviet situations and new experience, old shapes are turned into sites of complex strategies of formal recycling. Turning now first to the general intertextual relationship between the two texts, it can be quickly established that we are dealing with some form of cultural recycling. Early on, Prashanius Matroi features a passage that encompasses the main themes and attitudes, as well as titles of both novels. As it says here in, unfortunately, my English translation, because it was too late to get one here in Moscow, where it's a little bit more difficult. Theirs was the fastest, earliest farewell from Matyara. When it came to the matter of resettlement, who was to move where, Uncle Yegor, out of spite or because he was simply feeling lost, signed up for the very town in which they were building the GES, that is the hydroelectric power station. They were putting up 2 big houses for people just like him, the lonely and miserable from the flood zone. The deal was a simple exchange. They would not receive a single compact for their huts. Instead, they would get an apartment in town. Prashanius Matroi narrates the final months of existence of the village Matyara, located on an island on the river Angara in southern Siberia. On the horizon looms the village's flooding, necessary for the construction of the above-mentioned hydroelectric power station. The novel thereby quite clearly alludes to the construction of the Bratsk hydroelectric power plant between 1954 and 67. A project that Ilya Kukulin called one of the most important episodes of the internally colonial politics of the 1950s and 60s. Indeed, Prashanius Matroi narrates a classically colonial episode in which the center possesses technology, wealth, political power, and ideology, and saps the periphery of its raw materials and its own social order, in the words of Edith Klaus. Rasputin's novel addresses the consequences of this internal colonization, particularly in regard to cultural memory and tradition. While the novel does address the village's struggles with the administrative authorities, in this passage, the absence of financial compensation, it focuses mainly on the cultural, philosophical, and psychological consequences of their resettlement into small regional towns. As Chiara Mayer-Rieck holds, the plot literalizes the idea of a vanishing world. Lost with Mathura is the possibility of a traditional celestness that translates as wholeness, a, quote, generally traditional rural worldview with its mixture of Christian and pre-Christian ideas on the unity of the living and the dead, of the human and the natural worlds. Out of the loss of Mathura, the native soil and the traditional rural life attached to it, results the condition of rasterianos, which could be translated as lostness or maybe displacement, a term that features prominently throughout the text. The main characters, above all the elderly woman and moral center of the novel, Daria, struggle with their anticipated displacement in a world that values modernization higher than traditional wholeness and the century-long continuity of family histories. As Mark Lipovietsky puts it a little less positively, village prose typically operates on the postulation of a, quote, retro-utopia based on the values of traditional culture, religiousness, xenophobia, and patriarchal structures. Zona Zatoplenia by Senchin operates on essentially the same theme, but transposes it to the post-Soviet era, or more specifically the early 2000s, a time in which Russia's transition to a globalized market economy starts to pick up pace. As in Prashanie, the novel narrates the eviction of a number of villages by the Angara, mainly the villages Pilyevo and Bolshakov, for the purpose of the construction of a hydroelectric power station. Curiously, this construction site is itself a case of literal recycling, as the project sets out to finish construction on a power plant that was already half built during the Soviet times. The Soviet remnant is mobilized, however, to fulfill the needs of Russia's new market economy and particularly its elites. The project is the thought child of the owner of a stock-noted company operating from Cyprus. It is financed by an oligarch referred to as the Aluminium King, made possible by the former's connection to the local political elites, and has the aim to produce electricity for the Chinese market. While the colonizers have thus changed, their impact on the rural areas destined for flooding remains essentially the same. The term rasterianos is fit to describe the state of most of the novel's characters as well. Most fear the loss of the only home they ever knew, they struggle to adapt in their new urban environments, and they appear entirely powerless in their interactions with authorities. However, Zona Zatoplenia makes distinct changes to its source material. Wholeness is certainly no value that can be attributed to either Pilyevo or Bolshakov. The living and the dead have long not formed an undissolvable unit, as until the novel's opening sequence, nobody had died in the village for a long time. The old die in nearby hospitals and the young have moved to the cities anyways. Also, those who have remained in Pilyevo do not exhibit a deep connection to the soil they inhabit. As one critic puts it, a people in the spiritual and moral sense of the word already does not exist in this novel. There is only population. Indeed, when reading Zona Zatoplenia, it is quite unclear if there is such a thing as a traditional village community that one could feel nostalgic about in the first place. Alexander Zhurov claimed that Senchin has written a postscriptum to Prashania's Mataroi. This is only partially true. It's correct that Prashania ends on the eve of the expected flooding of Mathura, whereas Zona Zatoplenia narrates also events after the resettlement and flooding. However, it also narrates the phase before the flooding that serves as narrated time in Prashania. It considerably reworks its source material, though. While Rasputin's text proceeds in more or less linear form and only once moves the setting from Mathura to a nearby town, Zona Zatoplenia tells its stories in 10 fragmented chapters which loosely correlate to one another. This points to its main strategy of recycling. Instead of simply repeating the work of its predecessor in a different historical context, it takes it apart for scrap, using different bits of its material in those instances when they are of use. In the following section of my talk now, I will address one of these concrete instances of formal recycling under the term retrofitting that I just introduced. Among its many instances of nostalgically displaying traditional rural life or mourning its imminent decay, Prashania's Mataroi features one specifically striking philosophical key section. Shortly before Mathura's final flooding, Daria's grandson Andrei pays a final visit to the village. There, he reveals to his grandmother and his father Pavel that he left his former factory job in order to partake in the construction of the very plant that will extinguish Mathura. In arguing for his decision, Andrei epitomizes the essence of the novel's main conflict between continuity and progress, focusing especially on the category time. As he says, Now is a time when it's just a crime to sit in one spot. You would like to sit idly around here, nonetheless they will lift you out of here. It's such a lively time. Everything is in motion. I want my work to be visible. I want it to last forever, so what good is the factory to me? Do we have a problem with the sound now? Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. There is a construction going on outside of my apartment and they're getting louder. I need a hunt somewhere where there's young folks, like myself, where everything will be different and new. The guess will last for 1,000 years. Andrei's account is full of metaphors of dynamic, progressive, forward-leaping time that is constantly in motion, lively, with the capacity to alter the course of space. Am I audible?
Maybe you have some earphones with microphone.
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. Hang on 1 second, please. Or maybe they are already, or maybe this was just a very brief interlude. Right. I hope this did the job. With Andrei, the dying world of Matira is infiltrated by an actually socialist realist hero for whom, following Kathleen Partey, reality counts in its revolutionary development as it is expressed in Valentin Katayev's 1932 novel Time Forward, where the industrialization effort is seen in terms of the speeding up of time. Andrei explicitly juxtaposes this position with that of his father and particularly his grandmother, who he claims sit idly in their village, ignoring the fact that they will be washed over by the course of historical time as it is indeed moving forward. Prashania here operates on a village prototypical conflict between historical progress and rural beats, or everyday life, which clearly stood in the way of a mechanized and collectivized future. Opposed to Andrei stand partially his father Pavel, but especially his grandmother Daria. Although not taken entirely seriously by her grandson, she projects the already mentioned theme of displacement onto him as he, quote, detached himself from the soil and won't ever return. Without attachment to one's quasi-natural traditional environment, she predicts, you and all the others will quickly lose yourselves along the way. While Andrei views progress as positively necessary, Daria is convinced the only necessity is that of Andrei being steamrolled by the very thing he puts his hopes in. Crucially, Prashani frames this conflict as a generational one. It is not a complete outsider who functions as the carrier of a socialist realist logic, but the grandson of the novel's most emphatically rooted character. Particularly though, Andrei himself frames the conflict in general as generational. As he says, work is divided by age as well. Where there's new things built, that's where the young go. And shortly after, he draws an analogue between the construction of the GES and the foundation of Matira itself, saying that somebody came and stayed, and it turned out that the soil without Matira really wasn't enough. And then his son went further, and his son's son still further. It is to Andrei a law of life not to hinder the young. However, the moving forward of generations involves his own self-colonization. As Ilya Kukulin argues following Frantz Fanon, the indigenous people need to understand themselves simultaneously from inside and outside, with the eyes of the colonizer. In the third generation, the position of the colonizer seems to be entirely internalized, as Andrei comprehends himself as an agent of socialist progress. Oh, I missed a quote there, I'm sorry. Zona Zatoplenia early on features a scene that is superficially similar to the one described just now. The inhabitants of the village Bolshakov have just been informed that the resettlement, which they awaited sometimes more, sometimes less for the last 30 years, will finally take place. Bolshakov is stylized as a metaphorical matter, gaining a status of an island not because of being surrounded by water, but because during the 1990s, it was cut off from any beneficial economic relationships with the regional towns, a fatalistically sober twist on Prashania's philosophical trajectory. The news hit the divorced couple Yuri and Natalia Mastyakov absurdly hard. Because they are still formally registered in one and the same address together with their son, who has long moved to the city, they are assigned a 2-room apartment for 3 people. In this situation, Zona Zatoplenia performs a formal recycling in the sense of Pushakin's retrofitting. It borrows the general narrative organization of Andrei's return to Matra, as well as a few distinct markers from the conversation described above. The Masyakovs await the arrival of their son, who, most likely not coincidentally, shares a name with Darya's grandson Andrei. Just as his namesake, Andrei appears as an active subject opposed to his passive parents, in whose village there hadn't been, quote, serious work for a long time. He fought in the Chechen War at the end of the 90s. After returning, only spent a short time at his parents' house before moving to the city, finding a job, renting out an apartment. I'm sorry. Wydarzeń bukvalno 5 minut. Bukvalno. He said, "Все Боже, ничего." Well, fought in the Chechen War. After returning, only spent a short time at his parents' house before moving to the city, finding a job, renting out an apartment, and setting himself up with his girlfriend Darya. Another nod to Rasputin's text. All in all, Andrei can be said to have successfully navigated the transition at the turn of the millennia, which, very similar to Andrei in Prashania, required him to adapt to new environments and historical situations and allow for a hybrid positioning between his rural descent and his now urbanized life. However, the text only recycles this general outer form of Andrei's return in Prashania. Instead of rewriting the same section, it uses its formal setup to retrofit a newly post-Soviet situation. The conversation between Andrei and his parents is outright purged of any philosophical argument. Not a word is devoted to a wish for continuity or enthusiasm for progress. Instead, as a critic named Koftun argued, all three are occupied with pragmatic questions exclusively, how to make the best of the absurd administrative loophole they find themselves in. A real solution is off the table. Andrei has no intention to move into the new flat, and the dream of his father to found a family home is rendered impossible by the absence of financial resources. Whereas Darya in Rasputin's novel exemplifies something that Alexander Vazhinchuk termed inner freedom, and thus at least philosophically mobilizes the means to pose a nostalgic counterpoint to the logic of modernization, Sentient's characters are entirely incapable of opposing the course of governmental bureaucracy. Hence, also the generational conflict that characterized the corresponding passage in Prashania is entirely absent from Zona Zatoplenia. Andrei is consulted as somebody who could advise on how to navigate the situation, but ultimately can only share in the observation that the situation is inescapable, in consequence of socio-political and economic transition, and essentially through the collapse of the USSR, as Katarina Yashchevska holds. This has to be seen as a line of continuity, though, that forms the basis for the possibility of formal recycling. Social transitions are in both texts inescapable, overwhelming, and irreversible. What becomes evident in the comparison of the two passages is that in PSM, Prashania's Matra, there is still space for conflict as carriers of traditional rural culture that still exists and remember their past in the village nostalgically. In Zona Zatoplenia, the now market economy-induced change is already met exclusively with defeatism and resignation. Ilya Kukulin argued that Russia has been and still is colonized by its own bureaucracy. In Zona Zatoplenia, this is already the case to an extreme extent, so that bureaucracy can act on its subordinates practically without restriction. Fittingly, the theme of historical time comes up much later in the text when a different character, Dmitry, is threatened by the director of flood preparation. The director accuses Dmitry, and I quote here again, to not understand the necessities of the time at all. The guess is a project in which private enterprise and state cooperate. That is how it goes all over the world, at least in the civilized world. Appearing as a clearly bureaucratic colonizer who draws a distinction between the civilized world and whichever world Dmitry belongs to, this bureaucrat, however, also does not deliver an enthusiastic embrace of the speeding up of modernization, but merely refers to the impossibility to resist a project in which both bureaucrats and the elites of market economy are involved. In Zona Zatoplenia, there is no sense of real progress, neither on the side of the colonized nor on that of the colonizer. To end my talk now, I would very briefly like to propose that it is precisely this lack of any idea of progress that motivates the strategy of retrofitting. As Ushakin argues, retrofitting is most prevalent then when the present forms available seem unfit entirely to describe a perceived reality. I therefore think that retrofitting and cultural recycling in maybe a more general sense could be understood in close relation to Laurent Berland's concept of the impasse. The impasse, according to Berland, designates a time of dithering from which someone or some situation cannot move forward. It is almost intuitive to see sentience characters who are deprived of any philosophical but also economic perspective and agency as struggling with just such an impasse. All the more as Berland identifies as its foundation the formation of a new global precariat starting in the 1990s. The aesthetic of the impasse then is shaped by the fraying of norms, that is, of genres of reliable being. This is precisely where the impasse shares a lot with Ushakin's retrofitting. Both crucially operate on the feeling that present forms or genres have run out of steam and cannot adequately represent the present state of affairs anymore. Zona Zatoplenia answers this with, as Mark Lipovetsky so fittingly put it, a retro-utopia. However, not necessarily a moral one, as the philosophical essence of Rasputin's novel is lost. Rather, it engages in a formal retro-utopia that does not really exhibit any nostalgia for the social order that is lost, but for the mere possibility to adequately represent the struggle in peripheral places with the historical in times of historical impasse, both aesthetically and politically. Thank you. That's it from my side. I hope the disturbance by the construction workers was not too much. He said the first time he was going to stop and then didn't.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists. And now is time for questions and comments. But first, I ask Tony to answer Irena questions from chat. Where does the term decadent socialism come from, and what exactly qualifies socialism as decadent?
Okay. Thank you, Rena, for this question. So about decadent socialism, I first encountered the term decadent socialism in the work of Masha Kolanovic. She did an amazing job regarding the popular culture in Yugoslavia, and she released a wonderful book, Udarnik, Burtovnik, Potrošač. I don't know how it's in English, but I will suggest that book for everyone who is interested in Yugoslav culture, literature, and popular culture, especially if you understand the Serbo-Croatian. I'm sorry, I have a little problem with stutter, so there are some words that are a little bit difficult for me to pronounce it. So about the decadent socialism, the first thing she refers to, I think Masha Kolanovic, she refers to decadent socialism to the period of Yugoslav socialism in the late 1970s and the 1980s. So if you're gonna describe decadent socialism, we need to understand the term decadent. The decadent, it means when something is going, when something is declining. So in the final years of Yugoslavia, there were lots of political crises. There was an economical crisis. So everything was going, let's say, it was going downhill. And it all started with also, which is also one of the symbolic start of decadent socialism, is the death of Yugoslav leader, Josip Broz Tito. And also after that, the nationalism started to rise. It became more and more vocal. The nationalism became more and more vocal, and that heightened the utopian idea of brotherhood and unity. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, and encourage you to ask questions or any comment.
If you don't mind, then I would have one for Ellen.
Of course, please.
Ellen, I was wondering about this term that you used, memory chains, to describe how, if I got it right, to describe how earlier events are talked about and mobilized to actually talk about different historical events that might be closer to the present, and sort of mobilize them for that. And I was wondering, because I'm dealing with a lot of problems like that in my PhD project, in which earlier sources are mobilized in later sources, and I'm always sort of not at a loss, but I'm sort of wondering how to best describe these intertranstemporal relationships between them. And I was wondering if memory chains is sort of a good metaphor for it, because I'm struggling a bit with the continuity that it implies. In a chain, there's one piece after another, and that's just how it continuously stretches out. And it seems like maybe in these moments of when an old event is mobilized, or also an old cultural object is mobilized, the relationships are just more punctual and more isolated, or not isolated, but not as continuous as a chain would imply. So I'd really like to hear what you think about that.
And this was a question for me, wasn't it? I missed the first part of your question. I'm sorry. It was my internet that went
the question away. was about this term that you used, memory chains, to describe this relationship between present cultural objects and historical events that they might mobilize to actually talk about something in the present. And I'm wondering if sort of the metaphor of the chain simply is the best way to put it, because a chain implies this continuity of one piece after another, and it seems to me that
I think maybe I can't swear that it is.
Sorry?
No, I can't be sure that it's the best metaphor, no. But I still think that it is a quite good metaphor to describe it, that they are not, these remediations are not isolated. Of course, there is the impact of coincidence. And as I was trying to say, but maybe didn't say it clearly enough, I think that there is also a sort of human factor in nostalgia. There is an unpolitical factor of time, even when there are political interests involved. For example, my work was on children's cartoons, and the creators of today's cartoon, they were indeed children when the Soviet cartoons were created. It's a very easy explanation that does not include some chain, or it's just the time factor. Still, I think it's a quite good way to express it, and I would advise you to read the book by Marielle Biermars. I think it will be very interesting for you.
Would you mind typing the name in the chat for me? That's much easier than spelling it sort of correctly by listening. That would be
no, it's not so easy. So it's here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, anyone else would like to ask questions? Okay, Rita, please.
Hello, I have a question for Tony. And Tony, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. So my question has to do with rock music and rock culture and new wave that you talked about. And you mentioned that it plays, a very significant role as a cultural signifier. So my question is, would you call this a resurgence or a sort of resurrection? Meaning, was there ever a lull in the significance of rock culture, of new wave, in kind of post-Yugoslav public discourse or mass media, or was this interest in its significance relatively stable? And another question I have is a practical question. Is Black and White World available either with Russian or English subtitles? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, you cannot watch the TV show, because if you want to watch it, you need to go to the site of Croatian National Television, and unfortunately, they don't have any subtitles. So unfortunately, for now, there is no way to watch a TV show, but fingers crossed that it can find some way to either to Netflix or to HBO or something like that. For the first question, funny thing about park music in Yugoslavia. Park music, as let's say, park music that was in UK, United Kingdom, that music was against the system. While in Yugoslavia, the park musicians were not against the system. They were for socialism, but they were against the people who will abuse socialism, which was great. And after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the punk music and the new wave music, it remained relatively stable, but in the last couple of years, it became more and more popular. As you can all notice that in the last 15 years, it has become popular not only in post-Yugoslav sphere, but everywhere. If you watch on Netflix, you have a TV show called Stranger Things, which just suggests how the 80s were popular. So Black and White World shows that not that template, but that atmosphere of the 80s, that nostalgia for the 80s to create this fictional microcosmos of Yugoslavia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And any comments? More? Valerie, please.
I have a question to Thomas about зона затопления. I have perhaps a little bit naive question, but Thomas, maybe you can tell me about this. When I read contemporary Russian literature, every time when I start and read a book, new for me book, I every time is very surprised. One thing, another thing, but I'm very surprised. But can you tell me what is most striking for you in Зона затопления? Most surprising?
I think most surprising is how little it believes in its own success. That's a very striking thing in the sense of throughout this novel you get the feeling reading it that there is a very, very strong longing for this possibility to represent, to have a public discourse that represents the struggle of people in these southern Siberian areas, particularly because Senchen is from there, from not very far off from the Republic of Tuva. But it seems to not believe in its own possibility to represent this adequately in a way that also is in any way positively impactful in Russian public discourse. It features a passage that I couldn't talk about today because it would have just gone way beyond the scope of talking about recycling. It features a passage that you surely remember in which a writer who is evidently supposed to be Valentin Rasputin makes a visit to the town in which now villagers from the formerly resettled villages live, and speaks to those villagers. And they tell him about how horrible all these things is, and if he couldn't do something to improve their situation or say anything that would make them feel better at least. And all he can do is essentially sort of nod along and say, yeah, this is all horrible. And at the same time, Zona Zatoplenia seeks out, actually very thankful for this question, Zona Zatoplenia seeks out a different course by introducing a character called Olga, who is a journalist. And she's working for a regional newspaper called, if I remember correctly, right now, Golos Rabochего, the workers' voice, that used to be big and actually have influence in the region in Soviet days, and now is also crumbling. but she's writing these reports about the villages that are evacuated for the guests now, and she seems to have at least a little bit of success in representing this struggle, although it's not very much on the big scale. Also, she doesn't manage to change anything politically, but she seems to at least be capable of making people see the struggle a little bit, and reminds one very much of the articles you can constantly read almost in the Novaya Gazeta, for example, with reports about crumbling infrastructure in the peripheries and environmental hazards in the peripheries and such things. So I get the impression that this nostalgia for a formal recycle, this nostalgia for a form that adequately can represent this struggle on a political level is sort of almost reflected in the novel as a bit pointless, since it will not be found in a literary form, but in a more documentary form, which is actually quite telling, since Mark Lipovetsky put it in his essay, The Formal is Political, that documentary forms often arise in moments when the literary genres have sort of run out of steam, and then you get into more documentary shapes of storytelling. So it's really this running out of steam, I think. I think this is a novel that runs out of steam with every page and sort of notices more and more that it won't really achieve what it wants to achieve.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you for the question. That gave me a chance to elaborate a little more.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I perhaps have another question, quite personal, a little bit personal, to Ellen. Ellen, I do not see you.
I'm here. I just turned off my video.
This is personal question. I would like to ask you: do you like these multfilms which you so beautifully describe and analyze? Do you like it as a spectator? I don't know.
No, I don't like them. And yes. I adore Soviet cartoons. And I grew up in Sweden. I'm Swedish, but I am the mother of 3 Russian-speaking children. So I have watched these cartoons more than I would have wanted. I'm very familiar with Soviet cartoons and with Russian cartoons of today, and I don't like them.
Yeah,
I like some of them. But I find it very interesting.
But this personal question could be continued. Could be continued to another question. This is about the audience for which filmmakers work, making this kind of cultural production. I know that there is people, quite young people and teenagers, and maybe about this, who like them, very like. It's strange for me, but it is fact.
Yes, I think it's strange too, and I think it's a matter of, it's like a new time. I noticed that when it comes to Swedish cartoons as well, that I try to show my children cartoons that I loved when I was a kid, and it doesn't work. They really love these Bagatir films, and I can't understand it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Okay, we can finish. It was 7th session of our conference, and I think we'll need a few more minutes for a break. And thank you all the participants, especially speakers, and see you next session. Thank you.